Good afternoon, everyone. By the power of Apple, I am informed it is now 1 p.m. and I'm going to get us started. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Rob Finn, and I am the Director of Policy and Research for the Center for Community Progress. As many of you may know, we are the national leader for building strong, equitable communities where vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties are transformed into assets for neighbors and neighborhoods. Today, we are happy to be joining the Greater Ohio Policy Center to host the final webinar in their four-part series entitled Keeping People in Their Homes, which focused on strategies for neighborhood stability in the time of COVID. This series was made possible by partnership with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. As I've mentioned, each of the prior webinars in this four-part series addressed themes of neighborhood stability, but focused on strategies different actors can implement. Over the last few weeks, webinars explored the roles philanthropy, mission-driven developers, and local government elected officials and advocacy groups can play in supporting neighborhood stability efforts. The past webinars in this series were recorded and can be found on Greater Ohio's website at greaterohio.org. Today's webinar is entitled Local Government Programming to Support Neighborhood Stability, and will focus on several strategies local governments are embracing to deliver greater stability in their communities. Before I introduce our moderator for today, I want to address a few housekeeping questions. First, we have reserved 3 to 4 minutes for questions after each presentation and time at the end of the session for additional Q&A. For the Q&A and for any questions on the presentations, we ask you to please submit your question to us using the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat function and will ask the questions on behalf of audience members, so please do utilize the chat box. We ask that attendees keep themselves on mute and keep your video off throughout the program. We recommend that you watch this webinar using the speaker view, which you can find usually in the top right corner of the Zoom window, and that will give you fewer distractions. We will be making a recording of this webinar available afterwards, and that will be available on greaterohio.org. Also, since it's everyone's favorite question, the PowerPoint presentations that you will see today will be included in that video. So obviously feel free to access it afterward and direct anyone to it. If you would like a copy of the PowerPoint decks, please just include your email address in the chat box, which we'll save, and we can distribute those PowerPoints at the end of the program. So with that, I am happy to introduce today's moderator, Allison Goebel. Allison is Executive Director of the Greater Ohio Policy Center. She is responsible for charting GOPC's strategic direction, directing research, advocacy, and outreach teams, and securing resources for this work. Allison is the author of a number of research reports and policy briefs related to the revitalization of weak market, legacy cities, transportation funding, and local governance structures in Ohio. She has led the development of GOPC's housing analysis work and spearheaded several communities of practice that GOPC coordinates to help communities around the state learn from each other and advance public policy. Through her leadership, last year, GOPC successfully advocated for the passage of new statewide legislation that incentivizes the redevelopment of brownfield sites in Ohio. Welcome, Allison.
Rob, thank you so much. And thank you to the Center for Community Progress for partnering with us today. And thank you as well to the Lincoln Institute for your support. We're very excited to do this program. I am stepping in for Arlisha Wilson, who was our originally scheduled moderator. She and we ended up having some conflicts, and we thought it would be best not to burden Arlisha's schedule. So I'm stepping in, but we look forward to having her at a future webinar or other event. So right now, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, who is Shannon Meadows, a good friend of Greater Ohio's. Shannon is the Community Development Director in Springfield, Ohio, where at the city, she manages daily operations of the department, including oversight of the housing and urban development entitlement funds and other grant dollars. Shannon also coordinates and oversees planning, zoning and code enforcement, building regulations, development programs, housing rehabilitation, fair housing and mediation, minority business development, and community reinvestment in the city. Shannon does everything except collect the fees out of the parking meters, it sounds like. Shannon has been instrumental in the city's adoption and implementation of compassionate code enforcement strategies, which we're going to hear about more today, as well as some other efforts that are underway in the city to address community needs brought on by COVID. Shannon, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you, Allison. I am very honored to be with each of you today. So I will talk today about our engaged neighborhood planning process as well as compassionate code enforcement. As I reflected on this, I think that we could probably teach a semester of an entire higher education class from the lessons that we've learned, but we have 10 minutes. So with that, let's go ahead and we will move into getting to know Springfield. So the engaged neighborhood planning process here in Springfield started with one concept, which is how do we get to hope? And so we need hope for our future. We need hope for our neighborhoods. We need hope for Springfield to thrive. And we back that up and we come up with engagement leads to empowerment and empowerment leads to hope. In Springfield, we are located equidistant between Columbus and Dayton. And for much of our economic development, this is a wonderful asset. We are well positioned to really thrive in warehouse and transportation distribution, but we're also pinched by major metropolitan areas and dare say the two megapolises of the state of Ohio. And so we have to do things a little bit more creatively in Springfield. We are definitely a legacy city. We are probably the epitome of legacy city. And within our legacy city, we have legacy neighborhoods. And being a legacy city, we struggle. We struggle financially, we struggle with adaptability, and sometimes we just have to make decisions. How do we keep police and fire on the streets? Over years, we were confronted with those tough decisions, and it was at the expense of our neighborhoods. So recently, we engaged in the new redevelopment and planning approach of what we call the engaged neighborhood. And the engaged neighborhood is just immediately to the southwest of downtown. If we advance a little bit, there you go. We find the engaged neighborhood area, which is quite a large area, but there's just no good way to divide it up. Downtown is just as dependent on the success of this neighborhood as the neighborhood is dependent on the success of Springfield. And so we embark upon this plan, and we're guided by the fact that the community revitalization is hard, slow, and costly, and it is much easier to build new than it is to build hope. But if we're not going to build hope, then we're not going to thrive as a community. So we remind ourselves throughout this entire presentation, and I think throughout all of COVID and forward, that there's always moments when initiatives seem impossible. The impetus appear to have stalled. Neighbors are upset, they're fractious. Staff is ready to walk away. Funders are saying, is this really worth it? But for the most part, it's because we're tired. But the only way to move out is to move through. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about how Springfield has moved through COVID and moved through all of the obstacles of neighborhood re-engagement, neighborhood planning, and sustainable hope for our future. So if we move on, we didn't pick a neighborhood that was easy to start our re-engagement and planning after more than a generation of really focusing on survival. We were honored to be led by a city commission that was willing to engage people that had not been engaged in the neighborhood planning process for many years. And we had what was created a Springfield Housing Solutions Consortium, led by two elected officials as well as local lenders, realtors, and other stakeholders who finally said, you know what, we got to do something different. We're surviving, but we're not thriving. And so one day they looked at me and they said, what neighborhood, if you could pick one, what would it be? And I took them serious, and I picked this neighborhood just outside of the downtown area. Why did I pick it though? I picked it because, the feedback I was getting was, man, you guys are spending millions of dollars downtown. You're working so hard so that other people can see how great we are, but you've forgotten about who we are. And so it was important to start with an area that had already been engaged in the desire to transform themselves and transform the community. But when you got into the demographics, you really started to see this is an area of pure diversity, economically, ethnically, morally, um, opposite ends of the political spectrum, opposite ends of the income spectrum. But when you get down to the average in this neighborhood, it's poor. We have some of the wealthiest individuals living in industrial mansions in this area, but at the same time, our average income is $12,000. In this area, we have people who are desperately trying to maintain, and then we have people who are reaching down and trying to pull their neighbors up. And what we have found is by engaging and empowering all residents equally at the same table, we are seeing a rebirth of desire to build anew. So just we'll go ahead and move forward. You guys can look at those demographics later if you want. But how did we do it? Again, like I said, we can spend an entire semester talking about the ins and outs, but I want to focus just a little bit on identifying a geographic area that we're committed to not leaving. This area has become our CDBG target area. It is the area where we are working outside of the basic needs human services like homeless support and food security. This is the area where we're looking to invest all of our community development block grant dollars on infrastructure, rehabilitation, public facilities, public improvements, etc. In addition, we have refocused our efforts in this target area so that individuals can get to know City Hall. We want to be called we, not they. And that has been a guiding principle. Because in this area, we have 40% vacancy. That's 40% of our built structures and land that is currently vacant. Opportunity abounds, but you can imagine as you have been a long-term resident or neighbor of this legacy neighborhood, how it feels to see your history and your memories demolished. For many, many years, we worked on the effort of we have to balance our market. We have to balance our market. We have too many residential units to support the population we have. Well, we're balancing our market on paper, but we're decimating our neighborhoods. And so we're focused on bringing everyone to the table and reshaping the way that we do business in this particular engaged neighborhood to create empowerment, with the understanding that empowerment then leads to hope for the future. One of the ways that we've done this is through compassionate code enforcement. So if we could advance to the next slide, just two examples of the residential units that, that we have in this neighborhood. And one is vacant and one is not. Many times we have people who come through and they identify all of the vacant structures until they see someone come out on the front porch and pick up their mail. Disinvestment in housing has been going on in legacy communities for a long time, but eventually you have to draw the line and you have to say whatever it takes. And I am honored and blessed to be the community development director at the time that Springfield says we're drawing the line and we're doing whatever it takes. Compassionate code enforcement is at the forefront of this. What we have done is not only looked at bringing in planners and architects to shape neighborhood plans and neighborhood revitalization, but we've really confronted that perception of gentrification. See, the fact is in the middle of Ohio, in a fairly soft market, even when a residential market's booming, the reality of gentrification in Springfield is not very academically realistic. But the perception and the fear of gentrification is absolutely at the forefront. So how were we going to assure neighbors that we are not working to build something that others move into and you have to move out of. We created the Community Development Coordinator position. This position is a code enforcement officer on steroids. This officer is given a lot of flexibility. He is given a lot of tools to work with partnerships, organizations, and individuals throughout the community to do what it takes to make change. And this code enforcement officer coordinator is also an individual who has been given the flexibility to take time to get to know not only the neighbors, but the landlords and everyone else. So by doing this, the empowerment is building, and you can see the kind of change that has developed. If we can move to the after slides, it's almost impossible to tell that these are the same types of units. But this type of change just from engagement is happening throughout this neighborhood. And even in the face of COVID, we're gonna move through because Allison popped up, which means I'm out of time.
2 minutes.
Okay, we're gonna move to the last slide. Even in the COVID environment, staying engaged has really been something that has made palpable change. And you can see here in this first picture, you know, before COVID, our public workshop turnouts were in the 200s. Now they're in the 30s, but we can't stop. And just like we started, you know, we're tired, but the only way out is through. And so we continue to find every way that we can to engage all of the voices that will come to our table to speak up. It's not always easy, and it sure is not fast. What has been created by generations of perceived disengagement can't be fixed in 1 or 2 years. It will take decades. And one of the things that we've realized is that engaging our youth in the neighborhood planning process surely creates hope. But a lesson that I'll share, and it's a lesson as a mom, after we had mourned the loss of our momentum in engagement when COVID descended upon us, I kept thinking, how do we keep people talking? Everyone's in their own homes. How do we keep them engaged? And my 12-year-old daughter doesn't stop. She doesn't stop talking, right? So one of the great things that we were able to pull together was a summer camp that was socially distanced, where we took youth of the neighborhood and started engaging them in the same planning process that adults had been engaged in. And I can assure you, throughout the rest of the summer, those homes were filled with nothing but lessons of the Gammon House, which is a historic asset within the neighborhood, and infrastructure improvements and neighborhood plans, because 12-year-olds don't stop talking. And this was a wonderful, wonderful asset, a wonderful pivot during COVID. So to celebrate the fact that the youth continued our planning process within our socially distanced homes, we were able to bring together a subgroup of these youth to celebrate and paint a street outside of Gammon House, right in the center of the engaged neighborhood. Again, continuing momentum. And what we created was a signal quilt street mural that will be expanded this spring, summer, and fall all around this historic asset. And we'll just move through those pictures so that you can see the development of the quilt. This was done one Saturday morning prior to the dedication of the Gammon House historic marker as a part of the state of Ohio landmarks designation.
Shannon, may I jump in here?
Yes.
Cognizant of time. Maria, if you want to keep scrolling so that we can see some of those pictures, I want to make sure that we get to some of the questions, Shannon. So the first
That's
one,
right.
yeah, no, if the
Go ahead.
first one is, can you talk a little bit more about the tools that the community development coordinator has to fix up housing and address code violations?
Absolutely. Thank you. So the community development coordinator works with our community development team, right, with the same tools that many of us have through our entitlement grants, including home programs and housing rehab programs. But through the Springfield Housing Solutions Consortium, a group of volunteers have come together to donate products, donate materials. We work with other nonprofit organizations. So Jeremy has been given the flexibility to get outside the box and bring people to the table to meet the needs of that homeowner or that property owner. And one of my favorite stories to tell about our code enforcement coordinator is he has conversation. He doesn't communicate through enforcement letter, right? And so he's having conversation with a homeowner, and the homeowner says, I can't afford to paint my house. I can afford a can of paint, a paycheck. And Jeremy says, fine, let's put together a plan. A can of paint, a paycheck's fine. It has taken a year, but that home is painted. And it's that type of conversation and flexibility and those types of tools to work with other organizations and bring the full power of community that's really made that transformation.
Shannon, that's great. So, so there's the conversations and then the materials. I know, just because we know you, isn't there some nonprofits involved in on this process too?
We do. We have a number of nonprofits, including the Fuller Center. In Clark County, we have the Fuller Center instead of Habitat, as well as our Neighborhood Housing Partnership, which is a NeighborWorks organization. And then we have local lenders and realtors who just say, you know, if you need $300 for grandma to buy some paint, then let's get $300 for grandma to buy some paint. And then we have community service days. And so by elevating the realities of what others have just perceived as lack of code enforcement to actual need of community, we've been able to pull in volunteers and coordinate volunteers to help grandma or help my disabled uncle or the landlord who's just in a little bit over his or her head to make that change on the street, because it's not our perception anymore that you need to do this. It's our perception that we deserve this. And so bringing the nonprofits in to have that compassionate circle around improving neighborhood is really what has worked.
And then checking the chat, I guess one last question. We had several people commenting on how excited they were of your engagement with the neighborhood youth. Can you talk a little bit about just like the role of coordinating? So did the city go to the realtors and those other partners? Did they come to you? Yeah, just kind of talk about how those bridges were built.
Sure. So the bridges, the footers of the bridges actually started with a new commissioner who was elected. He was not going to give up on neighborhood reinvestment, nor was he going to give up on the concept that landlords need to be held accountable, because it's landlords' investments in neighborhoods that really kind of focus. And he met with some local lenders, and a small group was formed to talk about what can happen. What do we need to do to make it happen? And that small group then grew into the Springfield Housing Solutions Consortium, which is a very large group. And that group then was able to leverage public and private dollars that gave us that kick that we needed to engage planners and architects, not from Springfield, but from other places that have done it right, and to be able to engage them to a level that they could entrench in the neighborhood. We didn't go cheap. We had to go to the level that the neighborhoods deserved. And so it's really been that Housing Solutions Consortium that has guided each of the steps of creativity and application, because it's with their support and their voice that it's allowed us advocacy to make policy change, as well as buy paint, so that we can get grandma's house painted.
Well, Shannon, we look forward to hearing more. There was a question in the chat that I hope we get to at the end of the session. Until then, though, thank you so much. This has been really exciting to learn about. So we're going to switch now to Stacy Young, who is the director of the Preservation Compact, which is an initiative of the Community Investment Corporation in Chicago. As the director of the Preservation Compact, Ms. Young convenes a diverse group of stakeholders to build support for and develop and implement policies and programs related to the preservation of affordable rental housing. Under her leadership, the compact has helped expand dollars for rental retrofits drive building code relief, create an innovative property tax relief incentive, and launch a $34 million fund to encourage the creation of affordable rental units in high-cost markets. Additionally, she has led the efforts to develop a $48 million loan pool and a separate $5 million CDFI partnership, both focused on improving 1 to 4 unit buildings. Ms. Young is here today to share her experience developing property tax relief incentives that are keeping units affordable while also incentivizing neighborhood investment. And she's going to tell us how COVID has impacted this work. Welcome, Stacy.
Thank you very much, Allison. And I'm a little upset with you and the organizers that I have to follow Shannon and her fabulous work because this is a tough act to follow, but I'll try. But I did try to accommodate everyone because I'm going to cut down my 90 slides down to 75. So don't worry, it won't be too long. Just kidding. It's not going to be 75 slides. But before I get down to business about some work that we're doing in the Chicago area, I'm guessing that one thing that we share in common in the Chicago area with different communities in Ohio is a diversity of neighborhood types. Here in the Chicago area, we have some neighborhoods where rents are skyrocketing and investors are going bananas. And of course, we have other neighborhoods like Shannon was describing that are starved for just a little piece of that investment that those other neighborhoods are seeing. And the property tax incentive I'm going to focus on in a couple minutes addresses issues in both of those neighborhoods, which is why I'm pointing out what I think is probably a commonality we have with some communities in Ohio and other communities that might be listening in. So I'm going to today talk a little bit about the Community Investment Corporation, which is where I work. I'm also going to talk about the Preservation Compact, which is a policy collaborative at CIC that I head up. And then I'll talk about what the housing stock looks like really quickly, just to give you some context. And finally, dig into that property tax incentive proposal that our collaborative developed that both encourages investment and preserves affordability. So CIC is a nonprofit CDFI lender. We focus on financing acquisition rehab loans in the Chicago metro area. We typically are working with low and moderate income neighborhoods. We're working in those neighborhoods, typically with small to mid-sized for-profit developers. These are unsubsidized buildings, and again, just run by regular old people. These are small businesses. Think of, the little cupcake shop or something like that. So these are just small business people. They're not using fancy federal subsidies, tax credits. They're not nonprofits. A typical case is a janitor in an apartment building who saves up their dollars to buy the 6th flat next door. Those are our borrowers, and they run the majority of affordable rental in our region. People call it, again, this unsubsidized stock, the naturally occurring affordable housing stock. We have at CIC a $200 million pool to finance multifamily rental. And you just heard about some other programs that CIC and the Preservation Compact run. But just so you know, CIC has a contract with the city of Chicago to identify troubled multifamily rental buildings. If owners don't improve their buildings, the court appoints CIC as a receiver to directly address the court-ordered repairs. And then a lien goes on the property for the cost of those repairs. It's a very effective program. We also have a robust property management training program for those owners that I just described, those small business owners, since capacity is such a key to building strong rental buildings and of course blocks and neighborhoods. And I'm happy to talk about any of those, but that's a quick overview of CIC. Next slide, please. The other arm of CIC is what I head up, which is a policy collaborative called the Preservation Compact. Again, you just heard a bit about that. We develop strategies to preserve affordable rental housing in the Chicago metro area. And when I say preservation, I just mean keeping buildings in good condition and keeping rents affordable if possible. Our partners include all levels of government, for-profit and nonprofit building owners, lenders, civic groups, and tenant groups. And so I have here the work that's broken into these buckets, cost-based approaches. This kind of doesn't matter the neighborhood. These are policies to keep a lid on costs that affect all buildings, energy costs, property taxes that I'll talk about in a second, and the building code. Market-based approaches, again, this is what I mentioned earlier, programs that work in different types of markets, because I think most people recognize in some cases, different markets, buildings in different markets need different tools and strategies. And we also do a lot of government coordination. We coordinate with government on almost all our strategies, but we do have a specific effort focused solely on preserving government assisted properties. Next slide, please. As I just described, the compact targets both the subsidized and unsubsidized stock, but I wanted to talk for a minute about this naturally occurring affordable housing stock, and this slide gives you an idea. So across the country, it's estimated that about 75% of low-cost rental housing is privately owned and financed. Again, no subsidy, no public dollars. In terms of what we do in Chicago, in your brain, please move that little bracket up. It should be 52% plus 32% equals 84%, that little bracket off to the side. 84% of the rental housing is in buildings with less than 50 units in our neck of the woods. And only 12% in those larger rental buildings that a lot of people think about when they think of rental, especially in a city or metro area. But really, the naturally occurring affordable rental stock is in those less than 50 unit buildings. Next slide, please. And with all of that as background, today I'm going to focus on one policy initiative, a property tax incentive proposal. So as I mentioned, the collaborative that I head up includes a wide diversity of stakeholders, and we brought them all together to develop this proposal. So we had for-profit developers, nonprofit developers, community groups, different levels of government, and a lot of them, a lot of constituencies kind of focus on their niche, what they're really focused on in their geography or their sector. And certainly there are folks across the board that we brought together who have concerns about different kinds of neighborhoods and the idea of preservation in different kinds of neighborhoods. So as you see here, I try to break this down, and then we'll talk about how the proposal addresses these different types of neighborhoods. So when we think about lower cost markets, these are historically disinvested neighborhoods that have trouble accessing capital for repairs. And I mean, the owners in those neighborhoods who own buildings in those neighborhoods have trouble accessing capital. In those markets, the values of the buildings are lower. So the rents are also likely to be more affordable. In many cases, the owners, even if they tried to increase the rents, they wouldn't be able to, because the folks who live in those neighborhoods would choose a different place to live, right? They would choose a place with a lower rent. But these owners, again, these smaller owners who own this unsubsidized building stock, they have lean margins, and so they don't have a lot of wiggle room in their numbers, and they need an incentive to invest more in their buildings. We also have higher cost markets where owners don't have trouble accessing capital to invest and improve their buildings, but they need an incentive to keep the rents affordable. So again, very different neighborhood types. I know you are all familiar with these different neighborhood types, but we tried to come up with a proposal to address both. Next slide, please. So with all of that in mind, we created one proposal, and it doesn't reference in the proposal market types at all. It creates these two tiers and allows owners to self-select into the category that works best for their property, into the tier that works best for their property. So the baseline eligibility is that rental buildings invest the required amount of money. Again, this is all on the slide, or this proposal and incentive could apply to a new construction building as well. Then there are two tiers of affordability requirements and different amounts of relief that are associated with those affordability requirements. One tier is geared towards building owners in lower cost markets. So this is intended to incentivize more investment. And the affordability requirement is higher. Again, we don't require that someone tell us what market they're in, but we expect that as they think through how their building is situated and which kind of affordability requirement and investment requirement they can meet, they're going to self-select into the tier that works best for them. So again, in this first tier, the affordability requirement is higher, knowing that buildings in these lower cost markets likely already meet the affordability requirements, because we're talking about 60% of area median income, which is a pretty typical kind of affordable baseline. The investment requirement in this tier is also higher. Again, talking about the need for investment in those neighborhoods. And the assessed value reduction, the incentive itself is more generous. So if you see there's a 35% affordability requirement, but also a 35% reduction in assessed value. That second tier is geared towards building owners in higher cost markets. So this is intended to incentivize holding rents artificially affordable. So the rents are going to be higher than 60% of AMI most likely. The investment requirement is lower, given that properties are more likely to be in better condition in these higher cost markets because those markets are better able, they have higher values in their buildings and they can access capital more easily.
Stacey, I'm going to jump in and give you a 1.5-minute warning.
Sure. So we did extensive analysis. This proposal has not passed the state legislature, but we believe it's reasonable and practical. We wanted to understand the impact on the tax base and the fiscal impact. Because of the investment requirement, there is a negligible fiscal impact. That's because the amount of relief ends up looking almost like a pre-rehab freeze. The investment increases the value of the property by roughly 25 to 35%. So again, we're acquiring investment in the property that raises the value of the property. But again, that 25 to 35% also corresponds to the incentive amount. And so it ends up being kind of a wash in the end, and that's why there's very little fiscal impact. And again, it addresses different types of markets, so it has lots of support from different types of stakeholders. And again, it hasn't passed. I think COVID certainly slowed us down, but also focused a lot of attention on housing and equity. And I think that this proposal really addresses those things because of its kind of, multifaceted nature. So we look forward to, talking more this spring and fall about this incentive. And thanks again for the opportunity to present today.
Stacey, this is great, and we wish you the best of luck getting that through your legislature. I know how hard that work can be, but this is a very exciting proposal. There was a question before all the emails started to flood in about the name of the receivership program that you briefly mentioned. Do you mind sharing that? Oops. I think Stacey, have we lost you? All right, we're gonna, why don't we come back to Stacey here when she gets reloaded? Oh, there you are, Stacey. Welcome back. There was a bit of a freeze. I was asking, could you share the name of the receivership program that you mentioned very briefly, the arrangement you have with the courts?
Of course, it's called the Troubled Buildings Initiative. It has received some acclaim across the country because it is very unique. But just for the record, it's a little bit difficult to replicate depending on receivership laws in different states, but it has worked very well. And I'd be happy to talk to anyone afterwards in more detail.
Sure. And then last question before we move on, and again, we'll have time at the end of the hour to ask additional questions. But Stacey, the last question is: do you have a white paper or another resource that you can share with colleagues on the tax relief program proposal?
Sure. Yeah, it's not a white paper. We have a fact sheet, and we have some language about this on our website as well. But if I forward stuff to you guys, Allison,
we'll send it out.
you. Great. Yeah, happy to do it. Thank you.
Of course. Well, Stacey, again, an hour is always too short, but hopefully we'll have more time at the end. So I'm going to switch here. Thank you, Stacey. Thank you. I'm going to switch now here to introduce our last presenter, Sharetta Smith. Sharetta is the Chief of Staff for the City of Lima in Ohio. And in her role as Chief of Staff, Ms. Smith is responsible for overseeing city operations, including the coordination of policy and legislation, external affairs and communications, and leading many of the mayor's key initiatives. Ms. Smith has been instrumental in leading Lima's efforts to establish a housing task force with the goal of addressing neighborhood stability and reinvestment, low property values, and revitalization of the urban core. We're really happy to have you here today, Shireta. Thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing about just how the efforts are going at the early stages where you're at today. I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Allison, very much, and Greater Ohio Policy Center for this opportunity. Next slide, please. Thank you. So today we're just going to be talking about, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the city of Lima, and then we'll talk about housing in Lima, what our facts and figures are. Why a housing task force, and in that I'll be talking a little bit about the problem, the solution, our design studies, as well as the timeline for how we plan to tackle this work. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Lima, Ohio, which is not unique to what I've been hearing about the other cities on our webinar today, but Lima is a working class city. We are in the heart of Allen County. We are located along I-75 between the city of Dayton and the city of Toledo. Right in between a rich soybean and corn industry that provides over a quarter of the region's revenue. We also are a town that has some of the cheapest housing stock in America. Last year, the average home in Lima sold for just over $66,000. Lima also has a long history of a boom and bust economy, which started in about 1885 when a local paper mill owner by the name of Benjamin Farouk discovered oil here on his property along the banks of the Ottawa River. The other thing about Lima in our story is that about 10,000 jobs were lost in Lima between 1970 and 1980, which was followed by an impact of about $250 million in loss of revenue from those lost jobs and tax income to the city. And so as the jobs left, so did the people. In 1970, the population in the city of Lima peaked at 53,734. And at the end of 2019, according to American Community Survey census data, our population was a little under 37,000. And so thousands of people left Lima because of, again, the job loss and hollowed out our urban core, which basically left the city of Lima with a lot of blight. And so over the last 20 years, the strategy has been about blight removal, code enforcement, and also leveraging resources to attract investments. Next slide, please. So housing in Lima, as we stand today, in 2010, we had about 17,361 housing units. At the end of 2018, we were down to 16,949. Our vacancy rate is 5% above that of the state of Ohio at 15.1%. And again, the median value of owner-occupied homes is a little under $66,000. And over 40% of our population spends 35% or more of their income on rent. Next slide, please. That median gross rent for the city of Lima is $641 a month. And then the majority of our housing stock is also renter occupied. The last thing that I'll talk about with respect to housing by the numbers here in the city of Lima, if you can see kind of in the bottom right corner, the majority of our housing stock was built before 1940. And in fact, since 2014, we've only had 8 houses built within the core of the city. Next slide, please. So why a housing task force? Well, first of all, timing. So the creation of the Lima Housing Task Force comes at a time where we've had significant investment in our community. And I'm gonna fast forward and just talk about a little bit of that investment. Next slide, please. So our strategy, like I said, has been blight removal, code enforcement, and leveraging resources to attract investment. And I want to spend a little bit of time to just talk about what our community development department has been doing over the last 10 or 20 years, because I think it's important to point out the work, particularly for Rust Belt cities with some of the issues that we've experienced with respect to housing. But we have, over the last, since 2008, we have had demolition of 1,306 blighted structures within our city. From 2010 to 2020, the Community Development Department has provided needed repairs to over 117 homes. In addition to that, we provided down payment assistance to 141 first-time home buyers, which has led to the purchase of over $9 million in residential real estate. We provided counseling to 394 households to help them stay in their homes and to purchase homes. And we've leveraged our resources to amount to $1,107,000 in affordable home investments. And in addition to that, we've been able to leverage our home funds to support community development. A turning point for the city of Lima was the water project that is on your screen now, where we leveraged $500,000, $500,000 in home funds to invest in a $14 million renovation of a prior bank building in the heart of our downtown. This project resulted in 47 residential units. 10 of those units were market rate and the other one were for income eligible individuals and families. And then the project was also able to use low income housing tax credits, historic tax credits as well. And we also provided a CRA tax abatement to this project. But again, this investment was a turning point with respect to housing development in the city of Lima after experiencing just years of blight and suburban flight. Next slide, please. Another project, and I'll go through these quickly, is a senior housing project that's also in the city that was developed by our CHODO, which is New Lima Housing for the Future. This project was also financed by home funds and also received a CRA tax abatement. Next slide, please. And then another project, which is a completely, for the most part, private development in that there was no use of home funds, is the Metro Center, another renovation of a bank building in our downtown area that is currently being developed. This will be market rate apartment housing in the heart of downtown with rents expected to be anywhere from $1,000 to $2,500. Next slide, please. And there's also been residential developments in our neighborhoods. This is just one example of residential home that was built in our neighborhood where property was acquired using the city's land bank. Again, we also provided a CRA tax abatement. This house sold for $204,000 back in this past August. It's a 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath. And again, this was significant because the housing value within our area has been $66,000 and it's been pretty much stagnant over the last decade or so. Next slide, please. We also have another multifamily development, renovation of a school site. This is also another market rate rental project that's being privately developed. And it is also a use of City of Lima Land Bank property as well. Next slide, please. And then these are just some additional investments that are occurring throughout, again, in the core of the city with single and multi-family residential investments. Next slide, please. But the catalyst for the housing task force was a housing assessment that, with the support of City Council, the City of Lima hired a consultant back in 2019. This assessment provided public input through surveys, interviews, working meetings, and also looking at other studies and current programs with respect to housing and community development in the City of Lima. The assessment produced a 70+ page report in Lima that looked at the opportunities and the challenges with housing, as well as a broad set of recommendations. Some of the key facts that came out of that report was that, one, the low income wages of workers within our city affects affordability. Number two, that there is a projected 1,175 homes that need to be built within the city by the year 2030. Number 3, that the city had to address housing affordability at the same time as number 4, supporting private investment. And number 5, housing and neighborhoods needs to be revitalized. What the report did not provide was an implementation plan and consensus from the community about how to prioritize the work that needed to be done to revitalize our housing strategy. And so we developed the Housing Task Force. This Housing Task Force, really the work of the task force will be to analyze the depths of those problems and present solutions. And those are policy solutions, financial solutions, and product solutions to improve the quality and quantity and availability of housing, to stabilize and increase our population, to reduce blight, to improve property values, and again, to attract private investment. The Housing Task Force consists of over 50 members from our community. We have individuals from our banking community present. We have individuals from our economic development community present. City staff is present, as well as residents, as well as council members. And we've taken that work and taken the task force and divided the task force up into 3 subcommittees. The first subcommittee is the Design and Infrastructure Committee, which will be looking at where are the opportunities for investment within the city. And what that looks like is where are the vacant lots, where are the structures that need to be revitalized, and what is the plan to do that work. The next subcommittee that we have is our Innovation and Sustainability Subcommittee, who's really looking at the finances. How do we pay for the development that needs to occur within our city? And what are the funding mechanisms out there to increase our supply of housing units within the city of Lima? And then our last committee is our Policy and Implementation Committee, who will be looking at best practices both nationally and locally to do the work that we need to do, but also how do we preserve housing affordability? How do we build those mixed income communities? And how do we take measures to prevent anti-displacement of individuals that are already living in those neighborhoods where investments are being made? Next slide, please. So our timeline is we launched in December. From January to May, we'll do what we call data mining, to where we are inviting experts from within the state and around the country to come in and talk with us about housing. We've so far heard from OFA, Ohio Housing Financing Agency. We've heard from an individual that is an expert with form-based codes and smart growth. We are also scheduled to hear from the Greater Ohio Policy Center, as well as other individuals that will come in and talk with us, including an organization called Strong Towns as well. We'll spend June to August really drafting recommendations, and then we will submit a final report in September. Next slide. And here's my contact information if anyone has any questions.
Shireta, thank you so much. And this is super exciting, the work that's happening in Lima. And it's nice to see sort of at these early stages how it's all coming together. And also early stages, I liked how much of the pre-work you were able to share with us. So on that, one of the questions that came in through the chat was, did the land bank acquire property first and then turn it over to private investors? And I think Jorge's was asking in relation to some of the multifamily projects that you were describing sort of near the end of your run through the different property types.
Our normal process with respect to our land bank is to have an end user and a project first before we acquire the property.
Wonderful. So I know another question that that I'm curious about is just, so the task force you mentioned has over 50 people, right? And that you have these subgroups. How did you get everyone recruited? Was this sort of everyone wanted to be there, so you just tapped 2 or 3 of the right people and they brought their friends? Or can you talk a little bit about just how you made sure everyone was at the table? And then if we have time, how you manage such a large table?
Well, first off, from the beginning, we knew that having everyone at the table was going to be very important, particularly because of the spectrum of issues that we're dealing with housing in our community. And what I mean by that is I talked about earlier the number of houses that our report said that we need to have by the year 2030. But that report also talked about that we need housing for homeless individuals. We need affordable housing for low income individuals. We also need market rate housing. And we also need what's called, as you guys know, that missing middle housing, but also understanding that our resources are limited. It was very important to us to get everybody in the room, so to speak, and have real conversations about where we wanted to go as a community and what our priorities were going to be as a community. And it really was not hard to get everyone involved and on board. It really consisted of an email saying, we're rolling out this housing task force. Would you like to be a part? And there was an overwhelming yes. And individuals have been excited about where we are as a city, and individuals have been immensely contributing to the work, and looking at policies, best practices, and really, coming up with what our strategy is going to be and where our priorities are going to be.
Shireta, that's super helpful. So in the last 5 minutes here, really kind of more like 4 minutes, I wanted to open the floor up to all the presenters. First, I want to circle back to a question that was asked in the chat that we didn't get to for Shannon. And I know, Shannon, you have a hard stop in about 2 minutes, so we'll keep it fast. Someone was asking, how did you convince landlords to make repairs since the majority of the properties in the impact neighborhood are rental?
For sure. So that's not an easy task. We have been using our civil fine mechanism a lot more recently than we did in the past. In the past, there was hesitancy among elected officials as well as appointed officials to go too hard with civil fines. But at the end of the day, you gotta pay your bills and you gotta maintain your property. So in all honesty, part of the convincing of landlords in Springfield came with a change in city commission. And it's just that simple. It's a function of taking advantage of the timing and knowing that it's right, that you can start putting some policies in place that may not have been politically supported in the past. So civil fines, the vacant property registry, we didn't talk about that, but that was something that had been stymied for 20 years and finally went forward. And just the function, just the act of moving that forward got landlords' attention. And so there's a bit of a dawn of a new day. And that's really the basic reason that they're starting to participate.
That's great. Well, one last question before we wrap up here, and I'm interested to hear from everyone. Again, Shannon, we know you might have to hop off here, but when there are so many needs in the community, how do you prioritize one over the other? And Shireta, you started to talk a little bit about how just getting everyone at the table helped with that, but didn't know if you wanted to expand on that, or Stacy, if you wanted to address that question either, really about prioritization.
I think one of the things, Allison, if I can, I think one of the things that helped us, particularly here in the city of Lima, was just being able to provide a clear picture of the debt and challenges of housing issues in our community. Because a lot of times, if you're not dealing with it every day, you think, well, we just need better, property code enforcement, or, we just need, some more private investment, or, we just need to not, have so many, affordable houses, but, not in my backyard. And being able to bring everyone to the table that's involved with housing, whether that is the developers themselves, because they're on our housing task force, to those nonprofit organizations that provide ancillary housing service, to even the residents themselves, has really helped us provide an opportunity and a platform for all of those stakeholders to hear from one another and to, again, begin thinking about how are we going to solve these issues as a community. I'm not going to say it's easy. We've been at this. We just started in December. And our very last meeting was the first time that we actually started looking at maps and trying to decide where we're going to invest. but that's the work.
Wonderful. Stacy, I don't know if you wanted to add anything briefly on prioritization before we kick it over to Rob to wrap us up.
I mean, Sharetta said it all. Having everybody together in the same room so they can hear each other's perspectives, starting at ground zero, not having something in mind that someone else has suggested, but really saying, look, everybody, we want to hear from you. Explain where you're coming from. Not everyone's going to agree at the end, but at least they understand where everything came from the very beginning. And we're being honest brokers as the facilitators.
Wise words. Thanks, Stacy. Rob, I'm going to finish this up with you now. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Allison. It's almost 2 o'clock. We want to get everyone out of here on time. Thank you again to all of our panelists for their perspectives and advice on how to deal with the challenges we're all facing in our communities. Also, thank you for everyone who joined us today around much of the country. It is a difficult week for folks involved in cities to take time out. And so both for our panelists as well as for our audience, thank you so much. And we wish you well in dealing with all of the challenges that Mother Nature is bringing to us on top of all of the existing challenges we've been dealing with for the last year. Also, we want to thank our partner, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, for their support in developing this series and making it possible. We're interested in getting your feedback on the webinar and on the broader series. And there, as we let you know in the beginning, there is a short survey that is in the chat. We please ask everyone to click on that and just fill out. It should only take less than a minute, and your input will be really helpful. Please feel free to reach out to any of us at Greater Ohio Policy Center, Center for Community Progress, or our panelists today if you have specific questions we weren't able to get to. And the webinar has been recorded and will be archived on GOPC's website, which you can find at greaterohio.org. On behalf of my colleagues at Greater Ohio Policy Center and the Center for Community Progress, thank you so much for coming today. Goodbye.